In the late 19th century, archaeologists meticulously clearing the sprawling, sand-choked ruins of the Temple of Karnak encountered a bizarre architectural anomaly. Deep within the sacred precinct, surrounding the most holy sanctuaries, work crews found massive sandstone walls that served no structural purpose. They were tightly packed enclosures, hastily erected centuries ago to completely conceal a pair of towering pink granite obelisks. The engineers of antiquity had not toppled these monumental stone pillars. They had meticulously walled them up, hiding them from the Egyptian sun. When modern researchers finally removed the casing stones, they uncovered deeply carved hieroglyphs and royal cartouches belonging to a pharaoh who did not officially exist. Her name was entirely absent from the standard king lists, compiled by later dynasties. Yet, the sheer scale of the obelisks, each weighing well over 300 tons and standing nearly 30 meters tall, indicated a ruler commanding vast imperial resources. This was the signature of a pharaoh who had ruled the most powerful state in the ancient world at the height of its wealth, only to become the target of a systematic, highly organized state campaign to scrub her existence from human memory. Understanding how a supreme ruler could be so surgically cut out of the historical record requires us to reconstruct the political machinery of the 18th dynasty and examine the exact levers of power she manipulated to take the throne. If you find yourself drawn to unraveling these complex political anomalies of antiquity and exploring the hidden mechanics of ancient empires, consider subscribing. To grasp the magnitude of this institutional anomaly, we must look to the year 1479 BCE. The ruling monarch, Thutmose II, has succumbed to failing health after a relatively brief reign. His departure triggers an immediate crisis of succession. The royal court at Thebes is left with a precarious political vacuum. The only male heir is Thutmose III, a mere toddler born to a secondary harem wife named Iset. Because the boy is far too young to issue decrees, command the military, or perform the vital religious rituals required to maintain cosmic balance, the state apparatus requires a regent. Stepping into this void is the great royal wife, Hatshepsut. She is the widow of the departed king, but far more importantly, she is the eldest daughter of his predecessor, Thutmose I. In the complex, highly stratified world of the Egyptian royal court, bloodline dictates legitimacy, and Hatshepsut possesses the purest royal lineage in the empire. Furthermore, she holds the immensely powerful religious title of God's wife of Amun, granting her direct influence over the wealthiest religious institution in the state. Initially, the arrangement functions exactly as tradition dictates. Female regencies are not entirely unheard of in Egyptian antiquity. Royal women like Merneith and Neithhotep had managed state affairs in the distant past while male heirs came of age. For the first few years of the new reign, official inscriptions and temple reliefs depict the standard protocol. Hatshepsut is shown standing respectfully behind the young Thutmose III. She is fulfilling the expected role of a guiding queen mother, keeping the seat warm for the legitimate male sovereign. But looking closely at the primary sources and the chronological progression of stone reliefs from this period reveals a quiet, highly calculated institutional shift. Within just a few years, the visual hierarchy on the temple walls begins to change. Hatshepsut no longer stands behind the boy king. She stands beside him. Shortly after that, she is positioned in front of him. By the 7th year of the co-regency, the subtle maneuvering reaches its climax. Hatshepsut takes an unprecedented step, bypassing the traditional boundaries of a female regent and officially adopting the fivefold titulary of a reigning pharaoh. She assumes the ultimate authority of the Egyptian state. The core historical paradox driving this investigation is exactly how she achieved this without triggering a devastating civil war. Usurping absolute political and religious authority from a legitimate male heir should have fractured the royal court and divided the military. Instead, the transition is remarkably seamless. The answer lies in her brilliant manipulation of the inner chambers of the royal palace and her strategic alliances within the Temple of Karnak. Hatshepsut understood that she could not rely on brute force. She needed the bureaucracy. To solidify her institutional takeover, she carefully bypassed the military high command and instead forged an ironclad coalition with the religious and civil administrators of Thebes. Her most critical maneuver is securing the absolute loyalty of Happeseneb, whom she elevates to the position of High Priest of Amun. By promoting him, she hands him unprecedented administrative control over the temple treasuries, the granaries, and the vast agricultural estates owned by the priesthood. In return, the priesthood throws its immense theological and economic weight behind her ascension. Simultaneously, she promotes a brilliant commoner named Senenmut. Starting as a tutor to her daughter, Senenmut rapidly ascends the bureaucratic ladder to become the chief steward of the king. He is granted oversight of the royal estates and acts as the chief architect for her upcoming monumental building projects. By placing deeply loyal, highly capable men in the most critical nodes of the civil administration, Hatshepsut effectively locks down the state apparatus. She controls the wealth, she controls the labor force, and she controls the religious messaging. With the political foundation secured, she faces a massive ideological hurdle. The Egyptian concept of Maat, the cosmic order, balance, and justice that prevents the universe from descending into chaos, demands a male king to act as the intermediary between the gods and humanity. The office of the pharaoh is strictly masculine. To resolve this contradiction, Hatshepsut initiates a radical transformation of royal iconography. She does not attempt to change the rules of kingship. Instead, she molds herself to fit them. Surviving statuary from this period shows her gradually adopting the full regalia of a male pharaoh. She wears the Shendit kilt, the Nemes headcloth, and the traditional false beard of authority. Her statues are carved with the idealized broad-shouldered muscularity of a traditional Egyptian king. This was not an attempt to physically disguise her gender from her subjects. The hieroglyphic inscriptions covering these very statues often utilize feminine pronouns, referring to her as the daughter of Re. Instead, this visual transformation is a theological necessity. The state requires the visual continuity of the office. By presenting herself in the established masculine form, she assures the priesthood and the nobility that the cosmic balance remains undisturbed. Yet, political maneuvering and theological adjustments only provide a temporary mandate. As Hatshepsut successfully transforms herself into a living god, a pressing institutional problem looms on the horizon. Thutmose III is growing up. He is not locked away in a palace dungeon or exiled to a distant oasis. In a highly unusual arrangement that defies standard usurpation tactics, the boy remains deeply integrated into the royal administration. As he reaches adolescence, the state apparatus begins quietly shifting him into the sphere where a young Egyptian prince belongs: the military. He is sent to the garrisons in Memphis to train alongside the veteran commanders, charioteers, and infantry officers of the Egyptian army. He studies the logistics of siege warfare, the tactical deployment of archers, and the complex supply chains required to project power into the Levant and Nubia. This presents an extraordinary anomaly in the historical record. A reigning female sovereign, heavily reliant on a coalition of priests and civil bureaucrats, is deliberately allowing the deposed male heir to embed himself within the highest ranks of the armed forces. It is a precarious balancing act. Every year that passes, the legitimate heir becomes more capable, more connected to the generals, and more intimately aware of his stolen birthright. To maintain her fragile grip on power and prevent the military from rallying behind the young commander, Hatshepsut realizes that bureaucratic alliances are no longer enough. She must fundamentally prove her divine right to rule through an overwhelming display of economic prosperity and monumental construction. She has to manufacture a golden age so undeniable that the army would have no justification for a coup. The sheer scale of the architectural propaganda she is about to unleash on the Nile Valley will redefine the Egyptian landscape. But as she drains the imperial treasury to build her legacy, she sets into motion the very friction that will eventually lead to her systematic erasure from time. To understand the sheer willpower required to maintain an irregular grip on the Egyptian throne, you must look to the scorching, sun-baked granite quarries of Aswan, located more than 200 kilometers south of the capital at Thebes. Here, under the direct orders of the royal administration, laborers faced a staggering engineering challenge. To prove that the gods actively supported her unprecedented reign, the pharaoh mandated the extraction of monolithic blocks of pink granite. These were not standard building blocks. They were to become obelisks, the ultimate symbols of solar theology, intended to pierce the sky at the Temple of Karnak. Extracting these monoliths required a staggering mobilization of state resources. Ancient Egyptian stone masons did not possess iron or steel tools. Instead, work crews sat in cramped, blistering trenches carved directly into the bedrock, using spherical pounders made of dolerite, a rock harder than granite, to literally bash the stone away, millimeter by millimeter. It was grueling, mind-numbing labor that took over 7 months of continuous pounding just to free a single block. Once detached, the obelisks, each weighing in excess of 300 tons and measuring nearly 29 meters in length, had to be moved out of the quarry and onto the Nile. The logistical mechanics of this transport operation highlight the terrifying efficiency of the bureaucracy she controlled. Engineers constructed massive, reinforced barges from imported Levantine cedar, utilizing complex heavy-duty rope trusses to prevent the immense concentrated weight of the granite from snapping the wooden hulls in half. Because a barge carrying 300 tons of stone lacks maneuverability, it had to be towed. Records indicate that fleets of up to 27 smaller ships, powered by nearly 900 oarsmen rowing in precise synchronization, hauled these colossal monuments downstream to Thebes. When the fleet arrived, the engineering challenge escalated. Maneuvering a towering monolith into a perfectly vertical position without modern hydraulic cranes required tactical precision. The standard method involved constructing massive mud brick ramps, leading to a funnel filled with sand over the pedestal. The obelisk was hauled up the ramp and carefully eased onto the sand. As laborers systematically dug the sand out from bottom chambers, the immense stone pillar slowly and deliberately tilted downward, eventually settling perfectly onto its base. Finally, the pyramidion, the pointed cap at the summit, was sheathed in an alloy of gold and silver known as electrum. As the Egyptian sun rose, these peaks caught the light, acting as blinding, radiant beacons of her absolute authority. By aggressively expanding Karnak, she cemented her institutional alliance with the priesthood. But to truly secure her legacy, she needed to build something entirely unprecedented. Crossing to the west bank of the Nile, her administration ordered the construction of a mortuary temple set against the dramatic, towering limestone cliffs of Deir el-Bahari. Known as Djeser Djeseru, the Holy of Holies, the architecture of this complex completely abandoned the traditional, enclosed, fortress-like temples of her predecessors. Instead, the design featured 3 massive, terraced colonnades connected by grand ramps, perfectly integrating the structure into the sweeping vertical lines of the natural rock face. It remains one of the most brilliant architectural achievements of the ancient world. Yet, the true genius of Djeser Djeseru is not found in its structural engineering, but in the granular, highly calculated political propaganda carved into its walls. Moving along the middle colonnade, surviving limestone reliefs reveal a meticulous effort to rewrite her very origin. Here, the state architects carved the divine birth sequence. In these elaborate panels, the supreme deity, Amun, takes the physical form of her earthly father. The god is led by Thoth into the bedchamber of her mother, Queen Ahmose. The inscriptions describe how the queen is awakened by the divine scent of myrrh. Following this supernatural union, the god Khnum, the creator deity who fashions human bodies on his potter's wheel, is shown physically sculpting the infant form of the future female pharaoh, alongside her Ka, or vital soul. Consider the sheer audacity of this theological maneuver. By carving this sequence into the permanent record of the state, she fundamentally shifts the foundation of her legitimacy. She is no longer just the daughter of a mortal king, nor merely the widow of another. She is presenting herself to the political elite as the literal, biological offspring of the king of the gods. Questioning her right to sit on the throne was no longer a matter of administrative dispute. It was now an act of profound religious heresy. But monumental architecture and divine propaganda come at an astronomical price. The ancient Egyptian economy operated as a complex, state-managed redistributive system. Coinage did not exist. Wealth was measured in grain, cattle, linen, and precious metals. To fund the quarrying at Aswan, the massive flotillas on the Nile, and the tens of thousands of skilled artisans, draftsmen, and laborers at Deir el-Bahari, the imperial treasury was bleeding resources. Every stonemason required a daily ration of emmer wheat and barley for bread and beer. Every overseer required payment in standardized weights of copper and silver. As the temple complexes grew more lavish, the strain on the agricultural surplus intensified. This massive internal expenditure was creating a dangerous friction point within the empire. Traditionally, a pharaoh secured the loyalty of the elite through foreign military campaigns. Projecting power into the Levant, or south into Nubia, brought back vital plunder, captive labor, massive herds of livestock, tribute from vassal states, and enormous quantities of gold. This external revenue stream enriched the state, but more importantly, it rewarded the military high command. Generals expected spoils. Infantry commanders expected land grants. By pouring the empire's wealth into domestic religious monuments, the state apparatus was largely ignoring the military and waiting patiently within the highest ranks of that increasingly restless military establishment was the legitimate deposed male heir. Thutmose III was no longer a child. Operating out of the northern garrisons at Memphis, he had spent years mastering the brutal mechanics of late Bronze Age warfare. He understood the logistical deployment of massed infantry, the tactical superiority of the chariot corps, and the complex supply lines required to sustain an army in the field. More dangerously, he was earning the deep, unshakable respect of the veteran commanders. The female pharaoh found herself trapped in a severe institutional paradox. She could not authorize a massive military campaign in the Levant. Doing so would mean handing supreme command of the armed forces to her stepson, providing him with the exact leverage, battlefield glory, and loyal troops he would need to march back to Thebes and orchestrate a coup. But if she kept the army idle while the treasury slowly emptied to fund her architectural ambitions, the military leadership might turn on her out of pure economic frustration. She had successfully utilized the priesthood and the civil bureaucracy to secure the palace, but she could not indefinitely ignore the sprawling military apparatus anchored in the north. To maintain the fragile balance of power, the state desperately needed an influx of unimaginable wealth. She had to flood the granaries, fill the temple treasuries with exotic luxury goods, and manufacture a golden age so overwhelmingly prosperous that the army would have absolutely no justification to support a rebellion. She needed a massive foreign expedition, but one entirely devoid of military conquest. It had to be a logistical operation so immense and so successful that it would permanently silence any dissenting factions within the armed forces. Looking past the familiar trade routes of the Mediterranean and the heavily fortified borders of the Levant, the administration turned its eyes south, toward the treacherous, deep-water currents of the Red Sea. They prepared to launch a fleet into the unknown, aiming for a legendary, near-mythical territory that had not been visited by Egyptian ships in centuries. The royal administration needed a triumph that bypassed the generals entirely, yet delivered the vast wealth of a conquered empire. Their target was a territory the Egyptians called the Land of Punt. For centuries, this region had existed in the collective memory of the royal court as a semi-mythical realm. Located somewhere along the southern coast of the Red Sea, likely in the vicinity of modern-day Eritrea or eastern Sudan, Punt was the ultimate source of aromatics, exotic woods, and precious metals. But reaching it was not a simple matter of sailing down the Nile. Direct contact had been severed generations ago during the political fragmentation of the Middle Kingdom. Re-establishing this deep-water trade route required an institutional effort on a scale rarely seen in the ancient world. Look closely at the geography of Upper Egypt. The capital sits on the banks of the Nile. The sea lies over 150 kilometers to the east, separated by the unforgiving, jagged mountains of the eastern desert. You cannot sail a ship across a desert. So, the state bureaucracy engineered an alternative. Archaeological excavations at a site known as Mersa Gawasis on the Red Sea coast have revealed the staggering reality of how this was accomplished. Modern researchers found man-made caves carved directly into the fossilized coral terraces. Inside these subterranean vaults were thick, heavy-duty mooring ropes, storage jars, and thousands of cedar ship timbers. Many of these wooden planks still bore the original, handwritten hieratic assembly marks left by the shipwrights. The administration did not build the fleet on the coast. They built it in the shipyards of the capital. Ancient Egyptian shipwrights did not use iron nails or internal ribbing to construct their hulls. Instead, they relied on complex mortise and tenon joints, sliding precisely carved wooden pegs into matching slots to lock the thick cedar planks together. Once the vessels were fully constructed and tested on the river, they took them completely apart. Every plank, every mast, and every spool of rigging was meticulously cataloged, loaded onto the shoulders of thousands of laborers, and carried by foot across the scorching desert through a network of dry riverbeds known as the Wadi Hammamat. Along with the heavy timber, the supply columns had to utilize massive caravans of donkeys to carry enough water, dried fish, and grain to sustain the workforce under a punishing sun. Establishing the logistical supply chain of temporary water stations required to keep thousands of men alive in the eastern desert was a formidable bureaucratic achievement in its own right. Once they reached the coast, the shipwrights used those hieratic assembly marks to rebuild the deep water vessels directly on the shoreline. These were not fragile river barges. Surviving temple reliefs detail 5 massive seagoing ships, each measuring roughly 30 meters in length. They were equipped with large, complex A-frame masts and heavy steering oars. Because Egyptian ships lacked a deep internal keel, they utilized a massive internal hogging truss. This was a thick cable of twisted rope running from the bow to the stern, elevated over wooden crutches. By twisting the rope with a lever, the crew created immense tension that pulled the ends of the ship upward, preventing the wooden hull from sagging and snapping in the violent swells of the open ocean. Navigating the Red Sea in the 15th century BCE was a highly dangerous proposition. The waters are densely populated with razor-sharp coral reefs that can tear a wooden hull to pieces in seconds. Furthermore, the prevailing winds shift violently depending on the season. The flotilla, manned by over 200 rowers each, had to time their departure perfectly. They rode the northerly winds down the coast, staying close to the shoreline and navigating the treacherous shallow shoals entirely by sight. When the expedition finally made landfall on the shores of Punt, the historical record provides us with one of the most detailed accounts of a diplomatic exchange in antiquity. The royal scribes embedded with the fleet documented everything. They recorded the exact architecture of the Puntite villages, noting domed houses built on wooden stilts accessible by ladders, set among dense groves of palm trees and roaming cattle. The expedition was led by a royal envoy named Nasi. He did not arrive with an army of conquest. Instead, He arrived with a small detachment of royal guards, strictly for protection, flanked by tables laden with manufactured Egyptian goods. He presented bronze weapons, intricate jewelry, and wine. The local ruler, King Parahu, and his wife, Queen Ati, are depicted greeting the Egyptian envoy. What followed was a highly sophisticated, completely bloodless economic exchange. The sheer volume of wealth loaded into the holds of those 5 ships fundamentally altered the Egyptian economy. The scribes inventoried enormous quantities of unrefined gold, rings of silver, heavy elephant tusks, dark ebony wood, panther skins, and live baboons. But the absolute prize of the expedition, the resource the state desperately needed to maintain its theological supremacy, was incense. Incense was the lifeblood of the Egyptian religious apparatus. Massive quantities of frankincense and myrrh were burned daily in the temples to mask the scent of animal sacrifices, to perform embalming rituals, and to physically manifest the presence of the gods. Historically, Egypt had to purchase these resins from middlemen in the Levant at highly inflated prices. This expedition bypassed the middlemen entirely. But the administration went a step further. They did not just trade for dried resin. In an unprecedented botanical operation, the crews carefully uprooted 31 live myrrh trees. The official records specifically show these trees placed in large woven baskets, with their root systems packed carefully in native puntite soil, being carried up the gangplanks by teams of sailors. To keep dozens of large living trees alive during the long, brutal voyage back up the Red Sea and then across the eastern desert back to the Nile Valley required an unparalleled level of logistical care. The fleet returned triumphant. The living myrrh trees were successfully transplanted into the terraces of the state temples, creating lush, exotic gardens that proved the absolute favor of the gods. The imperial treasuries were suddenly overflowing with raw materials. Draftsmen and artisans had an unlimited supply of ivory and ebony to craft luxury goods for the nobility. The temples had a permanent domestic supply of sacred incense. This influx of wealth was a masterstroke of political calculus. By bypassing the traditional mechanics of military conquest, the royal administration had manufactured a period of overwhelming domestic prosperity. The granaries were full. The civil bureaucrats were immensely rich. The priesthood was completely pacified. Yet, as the state celebrated this unprecedented economic victory, a cold reality was settling over the military encampments in the north. The army had been completely sidelined. They had played no role in the greatest logistical triumph of the era. They received none of the public glory, and more importantly, they did not control the distribution of the newly acquired wealth. A stark divide had formed within the empire. In the south, centered around Thebes, a massive civil and religious bureaucracy was hoarding the riches of Punt. In the north, centered around the garrisons of Memphis, a sprawling, highly trained military machine sat idle. The reigning monarch had successfully neutralized any immediate economic justification for a rebellion. You cannot easily convince soldiers to march on a capital that is actively experiencing a golden age, but you also cannot indefinitely stall a massive standing army. Within the officer corps, a deep, structural resentment was quietly taking root. At the center of this martial sphere stood the supreme commander of those forces. Thutmose III was a full-grown man. He was a veteran tactical commander who had spent decades forging unbreakable bonds with the infantry generals and chariot commanders. He understood precisely what had happened. The civil bureaucracy had outmaneuvered him, effectively locking him out of his own empire through sheer economic force. As the wealth of Punt flowed into the southern temples, a calculated, institutional shift began to form within the military high command. The veteran officers realized that open conflict or a violent coup would shatter the state and destroy the very empire they were sworn to protect. If they were going to reclaim the throne and ensure the military regained its rightful place at the head of the Egyptian state, they could not use bronze swords. they would have to weaponize the bureaucracy itself. A quiet administrative tension was brewing. The military leadership was laying the groundwork for a massive, highly coordinated operation. It was a strategy that required immense patience. They would wait for the inevitable turning of the generations, and when the moment finally arrived, they would execute a targeted institutional strike designed to fundamentally rewrite the physical reality of the Egyptian landscape. In 1458 BCE, the unprecedented political arrangement at Thebes quietly expired. After 2 decades of managing the most powerful state apparatus in the ancient Mediterranean, the female pharaoh simply passed from the historical record. The exact nature of her departure remains a focal point of intense archaeological debate, but the immediate institutional reality was absolute. The supreme commander of the Egyptian armed forces, Thutmose III, finally assumed sole, undisputed control of the empire. The new sole ruler did not immediately turn his veteran officers against the civil bureaucracy that had sidelined him. Instead, he deployed the sprawling military machine he had been carefully honing in the northern garrisons outward. Sensing a moment of dynastic vulnerability during the transition of power, a massive coalition of Canaanite city-states in the Levant had severed their diplomatic ties with Egypt. The response from the new pharaoh was an immediate, overwhelming projection of force. He marched his veteran infantry and chariot corps across the Sinai Desert at a punishing pace. When he reached the logistical choke point before the heavily fortified city of Megiddo, his generals advised taking a wide, safe route around the mountains. Instead, Thutmose III executed one of the most brilliant tactical gambles of antiquity. He ordered his entire army to advance directly through the Aruna Pass. This was a jagged, dangerously narrow ravine where the Egyptian columns had to march in single file. If the enemy had anticipated this maneuver, they could have easily trapped and eliminated the entire Egyptian vanguard. But the speed and audacity of the decision caught the rebel coalition completely off guard. The Egyptian forces spilled out of the pass, deployed their heavy bronze-tipped spears and composite bows, and forced a catastrophic rout of the enemy lines. The ensuing 7-month siege of Megiddo secured the northern borders and triggered an unprecedented influx of foreign tribute. Enormous herds of livestock, finely crafted armor, and thousands of captive laborers poured back into the Nile Valley. The Egyptian army was finally flooded with the plunder, land grants, and battlefield glory they had been denied for decades. Over the next 20 years, the king conducted 17 highly organized military campaigns, expanding the imperial borders to their greatest territorial extent, reaching all the way to the banks of the Euphrates River. Yet, as you trace the internal administrative records of this golden military era, a massive structural contradiction emerges. For nearly 2 decades of his solo reign, the supreme military commander did absolutely nothing to target the legacy of his stepmother. The vast, terraced mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari remained completely intact. The towering pink granite obelisks at Karnak continued to dominate the capital's skyline. Her statues stood unblemished in the most sacred sanctuaries. Consider the administrative implications of this delay. If the prevailing historical assumption of a bitter, resentful stepson seeking immediate revenge were accurate, the very first act of his undisputed reign would have been the immediate physical destruction of her monuments. A military sovereign possessing absolute power does not wait 20 years to settle a personal vendetta. So, what specific institutional pressure suddenly shifted deep into his reign? Around year 42 of his overall reign, roughly 21 years after he became sole monarch, the state bureaucracy mobilized for an entirely different kind of campaign. The target was not a foreign army, but the historical landscape itself. The royal administration issued explicit directives to legions of skilled stonemasons, dispatching them to every major temple complex stretching from the Mediterranean coast all the way south into Nubian territory. This operation was not a chaotic frenzy of vandalism carried out by an unorganized faction. It was a surgical, deeply bureaucratic audit of monumental proportions. Royal scribes clutching papyrus scrolls had to physically cross-reference temple registries to locate every inscription, every statue, and every relief that bore her specific royal titles across hundreds of miles of territory. Once located, the work crews engaged. When you examine the surviving limestone walls at Deir el-Bahari, the tactical precision of these masons is highly evident. They did not use massive levers or battering rams to bring down the colonnades. Instead, laborers erected heavy wooden scaffolding, climbed to the upper terraces, and meticulously chiseled away only the physical manifestations of her pharaonic authority. Using heavy copper chisels, they scraped away the uraeus, the royal cobra resting on her brow. They removed the traditional false beard. They carefully ground down the idealized male musculature carved into her statues. Most importantly, they hunted down her royal cartouches. In the framework of ancient Egyptian theology, a person's eternal existence depended entirely on their name being remembered and spoken by the living. By physically cutting her throne name, Matkare, out of the stone, the state was attempting a metaphysical elimination. But the administration was highly calculated. They did not leave glaring, empty craters on the temple walls, as that would serve as a permanent visual admission that an illegitimate ruler had once occupied the space. Instead, after chiseling out her name, draftsmen used fine quartz sand to smooth the stone surface back down. They then recarved the blank spaces, seamlessly inserting the names of Thutmose I or Thutmose II. They effectively paved over her existence, ensuring the unbroken visual continuity of the male dynastic line. Here is where the specific instructions given to the work crews reveal the true motivation behind the campaign. The Masons were strictly ordered to erase her identity as a reigning male king. However, wherever she was depicted functioning in her earlier traditional role as the great royal wife or the god's wife of Amun, the carvings were left completely untouched. The state apparatus had absolutely no issue with her existing as a royal daughter. The institutional threat was solely the precedent of her wielding absolute sovereign power. The operation encountered a massive logistical and theological hurdle deep within the Temple of Karnak. The colossal pink granite obelisks she had erected during her architectural expansion were permanently embedded within the sacred precinct of the supreme deity. Toppling a monolith weighing in excess of 300 tons would require extreme physical force, risking severe structural damage to the surrounding temple halls. More dangerously, destroying a monument explicitly dedicated to Amun risked severe divine retribution and unrest among the powerful priesthood. The state engineers devised a brilliant compromise. They utilized massive mud brick ramps to carefully lay courses of heavy sandstone blocks around the bases of the monoliths. They built tightly packed enclosure walls that rose 12 meters high, acting as a stone sheath around the obelisks. This architectural casing completely hid her dedicatory inscriptions and political propaganda from public view without physically harming the sacred granite. The towering monuments remained perfectly intact, but their political origin was plunged into total darkness. The sheer scale, expense, and administrative effort required to execute this state-sponsored historical revision forces us to confront the central paradox. Why execute this massive logistical operation so late in the reign? The answer lies in the aging king's immediate political future. Thutmose III was approaching his final years. His chosen successor, the young prince Amenhotep II, was coming of age. The reigning monarch needed to ensure a flawless, uncontested transition of power. As long as the monumental architecture of a highly successful female pharaoh remained clearly visible across the empire, it served as a permanent, undeniable precedent. It proved to the nobility, the powerful civil administrators, and any ambitious royal women within the inner court that a female ruler could successfully hijack the state apparatus, lock out the military, and manufacture a massive economic boom. If a sudden succession crisis occurred after the king's departure, a rival faction could easily point to her reign as theological justification for another usurpation. The supreme commander of Egypt was not acting out of a sudden surge of delayed anger. He was acting exactly like a veteran military strategist, securing his supply lines before a final departure. By methodically scrubbing the female pharaoh from the physical landscape and substituting her with traditional male kings, the administration reestablished an unbroken, impenetrable chain of patriarchal succession. The erasure was a cold, calculated institutional necessity designed to immunize his son's future reign against any internal administrative threats. The Masons completed their work with relentless efficiency. Her freestanding statues were dragged out of the temples, methodically smashed to pieces, and discarded in deep limestone quarries. Her name vanished entirely from the official king lists for the next 3,000 years. But while the physical mechanics of how the 18th dynasty bureaucracy buried her legacy are now firmly understood, a massive void remains at the exact center of the chronology. How exactly did the most powerful woman in the ancient world exit the political stage in year 22? To understand the true resolution of this ancient conspiracy, we have to look past the chisels of the state masons and examine the fragmented, hidden reliefs that the architects of erasure missed, uncovering the fiercely debated mystery of her final days. The resolution to this ancient institutional cover-up began to materialize not in the halls of the royal palace, but deep within an unassuming, sand-filled depression near the limestone cliffs of the West Bank. In the 1920s, archaeological teams from the Metropolitan Museum of Art began clearing a massive, ancient quarry situated just outside the perimeter of the mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Digging through centuries of accumulated desert debris, they struck a dense, artificial layer of discarded stone. It was a vast, unorganized graveyard of royal statuary. The 18th dynasty state masons, tasked with erasing the phantom pharaoh, had been brutally efficient, but remarkably careless in their disposal methods. Thousands of shattered fragments of pink granite and painted limestone lay scattered in the dirt. Laborers in antiquity had dragged massive, freestanding statues out of the sacred temple precincts and systematically smashed them to pieces using heavy dolerite pounders. They shattered the idealized faces, cracked the false beards, and pulverized the inscribed bases. Once the physical manifestations of her authority were destroyed, the work crews simply swept the rubble into the nearest empty quarry and buried it. Yet, ancient Egyptian artisans operated on a highly rigid, standardized grid system for their monumental art. Proportions were uniform. Angles were mathematically consistent. Because of this extreme standardization, modern researchers were able to execute a staggering feat of three-dimensional reconstruction. By sorting tens of thousands of individual stone splinters, historians slowly reassembled the shattered sphinxes, the kneeling statues holding offering jars, and the towering depictions of the female monarch dressed in the regalia of Osiris. As these statues were meticulously cemented back together, the physical reality of her reign re-emerged from the dust. This painstaking reconstruction proved a critical historical point. The destruction of her legacy was unequivocally a top-down bureaucratic directive. A chaotic riot or an unorganized mob does not take the time to haul multi-ton granite monuments into designated disposal sites. The state apparatus wanted the visual evidence of her reign completely removed from the daily operations of the religious center. But the administration was not flawless. When executing an audit across hundreds of miles of temple walls, human error is inevitable. Look closely at the surviving limestone reliefs that remain standing inside the sanctuaries. Work crews operating heavy wooden scaffolding often missed specific inscriptions tucked high up into the darkest corners of the architraves. Inside the deepest enclosed chambers of Karnak, where the only illumination came from flickering torches, deep shadows obscured the uppermost registers of the walls. The royal scribes tasked with physically cross-referencing the temple registries simply failed to spot every single deeply carved cartouche. Those few overlooked symbols, tucked away in the darkness, provided the absolute, irrefutable proof that a female sovereign had possessed the highest executive authority in the state. These scattered fragments and surviving hieroglyphs fundamentally shift the modern historical assessment of the 18th dynasty. We no longer view the actions of Thutmose III through the dramatic, unreliable lens of a scorned, resentful stepson executing a petty emotional vendetta. A supreme military commander possessing absolute power does not wait 21 years to settle a personal score. Instead, the chronology points to a cold, calculated administrative maneuver. The systematic removal of her titles correlates precisely with the moment the aging military king elevated his own son, Amenhotep II, to the position of Corregent. The state was preparing for a massive transition of power. To guarantee a flawless, uncontested succession, the bureaucratic machinery had to permanently close the institutional loophole that had allowed a royal woman to hold supreme authority. By selectively replacing her pharaonic titles with those of her male predecessors, the administration manufactured a seamless, unbroken patriarchal timeline. They protected the dynasty by neutralizing the precedent. Because the architecture of this erasure is now thoroughly understood, the true logistical magnitude of her administration can be fully recognized. She did not merely hold the throne, she engineered a period of unparalleled domestic stability. By locking down the civil administration and manufacturing a massive economic boom through the Red Sea trade fleets, she accumulated a staggering reserve of national wealth. The grand irony of the 18th dynasty is that her vast accumulation of resources, grain, and precious metals directly funded the military apparatus that her stepson eventually deployed. She built the economic engine that allowed him to project Egyptian power all the way to the Euphrates River. Yet, a massive chronological void still anchors the center of this narrative. What exactly unfolded inside the royal palace in year 22? The primary sources fall entirely silent regarding the mechanics of the transition. For decades, researchers debated whether the increasingly restless military high command, finally mobilized and impatient, executed a quiet, targeted operation to remove her from the political stage. The resolution to this final mystery requires leaving the monumental temples and entering the subterranean royal burial sites. The search for the missing monarch eventually narrowed to a small, completely unadorned rock-cut tomb situated deep in the Valley of the Kings, officially designated as Tomb 60. When early 20th century excavators originally unsealed this chamber, they found no vast caches of gold or elaborate funerary furniture. The tomb had been heavily compromised in antiquity. It contained only 2 female mummies. One rested inside a wooden coffin belonging to a royal nurse. The other individual lay entirely unprotected, resting directly on the stone floor. Her left arm was positioned across her chest, a posture traditionally reserved for Egyptian queens, but the state had completely stripped away all identifying royal insignia. For nearly a century, the unidentified individual on the floor remained an anonymous casualty of the ancient era. But the deployment of modern forensic archaeology radically altered the investigation. The breakthrough did not originate within Tomb 60 itself. It came from a separate, heavily guarded location known as the Deir el-Bahari 320 cache. This was a secret subterranean vault where later priests had hidden dozens of royal mummies to protect them from widespread tomb robbing. Among the salvaged artifacts was a small, unassuming wooden canopic box used to house internal organs preserved during the mummification process. This specific box was stamped with the unmistakable throne name, Motkare. When researchers subjected this small wooden box to high-resolution digital scanning, the equipment detected a highly unusual anomaly hidden inside the organic material. Resting among the preserved tissue was a single, heavily worn human molar. The forensic team immediately turned their attention back to the unidentified female remains from Tomb 60. Utilizing advanced imaging technology, they meticulously scanned the jawline of the mummy resting on the stone floor. They discovered a corresponding empty socket in the upper palate. The exact, highly distinct root structure of the loose tooth perfectly matched the void in the jaw. The physical reality of her final days, as revealed by the skeletal analysis, strips the narrative of any grand political conspiracy. There was no military coup orchestrated in the dead of night. There was no targeted tactical elimination by a veteran general. The supreme commander of the Egyptian armed forces simply waited for human biology to run its course. The forensic data outlines the severe physical toll of maintaining supreme power in the ancient world. The analysis indicates she was roughly 50 years old at the time of her departure, a significantly advanced age for antiquity. The skeletal structure revealed profound bone density loss and evidence of a highly deteriorated physical condition. More critically, chemical analysis of a small flask bearing her royal insignia uncovered traces of a carcinogenic topical unguent. This toxic substance was likely applied repeatedly over many years to soothe a chronic, severe skin condition. The biological reality is that she succumbed to a cascading series of systemic illnesses. A localized infection originating from that very deteriorated molar, combined with a compromised immune system and the prolonged exposure to toxic medical treatments, ultimately triggered a fatal outcome. Her exit from the political stage was not an act of state violence. It was entirely natural. The 18th dynasty royal court experienced a quiet, inevitable transition. The supreme military commander simply stepped forward to claim his delayed inheritance, and the sprawling civil bureaucracy seamlessly pivoted to support the new, undisputed monarch. The ultimate irony of this massive, multi-generational political saga lies in the very mechanics of the state-sponsored erasure. The 18th dynasty administration deployed immense labor, vast logistical resources, and highly skilled masons to systematically bury her existence and maintain the cosmic balance of the patriarchal order. At the Temple of Karnak, those state engineers constructed tightly packed sandstone enclosure walls standing 12 meters high, specifically designed to plunge the lower halves of her massive pink granite obelisks into total darkness. By sealing those monoliths away from the eyes of the Egyptian people and the gods, the administration inadvertently created the perfect preservation environment. Those heavy stone sheaths protected the deeply carved cartouches from thousands of years of punishing desert winds, seasonal flooding, and relentless erosion. While the monuments of her male successors slowly wore away under the harsh Egyptian sun, her dedicatory inscriptions remained in pristine condition, safely locked inside a protective shell of the state's own making. She outmaneuvered the traditional military establishment, locked down the royal palace, and engineered an unprecedented golden age of domestic prosperity. In their desperate, calculated attempt to protect the dynastic line from her legacy, her successors guaranteed her survival. She achieved exactly what every ancient Egyptian monarch set out to accomplish when they carved their name into the living rock. She ensured that the living would continue to speak her name. She became immortal.